Caleb Harding hadn't touched another living soul with gentleness in 7 years. His hands knew fence wire and rifle stock and nothing else. But when he pulled that shivering barefoot boy out from behind his feed bins at 2 in the morning, ribs showing through a torn shirt, one eye swollen shut, knees cut raw from running, God knows how far something cracked open in his chest that he thought had calcified into nothing. He didn't think. He just pulled his trail coat off his own shoulders and wrapped it around the child. The boy flinched like he expected to be hit. If you believe one broken man can stand between a child and everything trying to destroy him, stay with me until the very last word. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. And if this moves you, subscribe to this channel. Every story I tell for people like you. The coat was too big by half. It swallowed the boy, whole collar falling off one shoulder, hem dragging the barn floor sleeves covering both hands entirely. And still the child grabbed the edges of it and pulled it around himself with the specific desperate grip of someone who hadn't been warm in a very long time. Caleb crouched down to eye level. He kept the lantern low off to the side, not in the boy's face. He'd learned that much from years of talking to frightened people. You don't shine a light at someone who's already blinded by fear. "What's your name, son?" Nothing. The boy's eyes tracked the barn door the way a trapped animal tracks an exit. "I'm not going to hurt you." Caleb kept his voice at the same register he used with spooked horses. "I'm not going to make you stay either. You want to leave that doors right there. But it's near freezing out, and you're not wearing shoes. So if you've got half a minute to spare, maybe you tell me your name first." The boy's jaw moved. Then, barely above the sound of the wind working the barn eaves, "Tommy." "Tommy." Caleb gave him a slow nod. "I'm Caleb Harding. This is my ranch. You're welcome here long as you need." He paused. "How long you been running?" Tommy's throat moved. 3 days. 3 days. Caleb did the math on those 3 days without any expression crossing his face. No shoes. January in Montana. A child with one eye swollen shut and ribs you could count through a shirt. 3 days is a long time, he said carefully. "Who are you running from?" The boy looked at him then, really looked at him. And what Caleb saw in those eyes wasn't just fear. It was the specific exhausted calculation of a child who has been let down by adults enough times that trust had become a luxury he'd stopped being able to afford. "You know a man named Harlan Doss," Tommy said. The name landed in the barn like a stone dropped in still water. Caleb felt the ripples of it move through him and kept his face absolutely neutral. "I know of him," he said. "Most people in this county do." "Then you know what he does to people who talk about what they've seen." Tommy's voice was 9 years old and about 40 years old at the same time. "My papa talked. They killed him for it. And now they're coming for me because I was there. I saw what happened. I saw all of it." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the January wind pushed hard against the barn walls, and somewhere in the dark, his horse ranger shifted and stamped and went still again. "Come inside," Caleb said. "I'll put something on the stove. You can tell me what you saw." "You don't want to know what I saw." Tommy's voice was flat. "People who know what I know end up like my papa." "Maybe." Caleb stood up and picked up the lantern. "But I'm going to go inside anyway. You're welcome to come with me." He walked toward the barn door without looking back. He'd learned that too. You don't drag a frightened thing toward you. You move away and let them follow when they're ready. He was halfway across the yard before he heard the small, uneven footsteps behind him, the coat trailing through the frost-stiff grass. He didn't turn around. He just kept walking to the house. Inside, he put wood on the fire and set a pan on the stove and didn't say a word while he worked. Tommy stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a full minute before he came in, and then he stood with his back against the wall, not sitting, watching Caleb with those ancient, careful eyes. Caleb put a bowl of beans and cornbread on the table and set a cup of water beside it and pulled out the chair and then walked to the far side of the kitchen and leaned against the counter with his coffee and looked out the window at nothing. He heard the boy sit. He heard him start to eat. He didn't look. When the bowl was empty, and the cornbread was gone, and Tommy had drunk the water down to the last drop, Caleb refilled the cup without being asked, and sat down across from him at the table. "Tell me about your papa," he said. Tommy wrapped both hands around the water cup. His name was Daniel Voss. He ran the Broken Creek cattle lease on the south 40 past the ridge. Been there 11 years. He stopped. Harlan Doss wanted that land. Wanted the water rights off the creek that run through it. Papa said no. Another pause longer. So Doss sent men with papers. Said Papa owed him money from a loan he'd taken 3 years back. Said the debt had tripled. Said if Papa couldn't pay, the lease transferred. Did your Papa owe him money? He borrowed $40 in the drought year. $40, Mr. Harding. He paid back 32 of it before the fall harvest. Doss's man came with a paper that said Papa owed 460. Tommy's voice didn't shake. That was the thing that got Caleb the voice not shaking. Like the boy had already cried every tear that was in him, and what was left was just the facts. The numbers were different from what Papa signed. Papa couldn't read the fine print. He trusted the wrong man. Caleb drank his coffee and said nothing. Last Tuesday, Doss sent 3 of his riders. Cole Raines was the one in front. Tommy's hands tightened on the cup. I know Cole Raines. Everybody knows him. He does what Doss tells him, and he doesn't lose sleep over it. He stopped. They came to tell Papa the grace period was up, that the land transferred as of that morning. Papa told them he had a letter from a lawyer in Billings that said the contract wasn't enforceable, that he was going to take it to a judge. Another pause. Cole Raines shot him on the porch before he finished the sentence. The kitchen went very quiet. I was in the woodpile. Tommy's voice dropped to almost nothing. 10 feet away. I saw it. I saw Cole Raines put the gun back in his holster and say to the other 2, "Get the papers out of the house." And they went inside, and I heard them tearing things up, and when they came out they rode north, and nobody came to help my papa. Nobody came. He looked up. I stayed with him until he wasn't breathing anymore. Then I ran. Caleb set his coffee cup down on the table. He put both hands flat on the wood and looked at them for a moment. The scar on his right hand, the one that ran from thumb to wrist, caught the firelight the way it always did. How old are you, Tommy? 9. 9 years old. In a stranger's kitchen at 2 in the morning, in a coat 3 times his size, with his father, 3 days dead in the Montana winter, and Cole Raines and Harlan Doss between him and anything that looked like the future. Listen to me, Caleb said. His voice came out flat and even and very deliberate. You're going to sleep tonight. There's a room down the hall with a bolt on the inside of the door, and I want you to use it. Not because you're in danger in this house, because you've been running for 3 days, and your body doesn't know how to stop yet, and a locked door might help your body believe it can. Tommy stared at him. Why do you care? Caleb looked at the boy for a long moment. Because somebody should, he said. Go on, room's down the hall. First door on the left. Tommy didn't move right away. He sat at the table with the water cup and looked at Caleb with that ancient calculating look running some kind of private accounting that Caleb recognized the accounting a person does when they're trying to decide if a thing that looks like safety is real or a trap they haven't found the edge of yet. Then he stood up. He was still wearing the coat. Caleb noticed he didn't offer to give it back. Mr. Harding. Yeah. Cole Raines has a man who rides this valley. Checks the farms south of the ridge. Tommy's voice was careful. He'll be looking for me. He knows I was there. I know, Caleb said. That doesn't scare you. Caleb looked at him. Go to sleep, son. Something shifted in the boy's face. Not trust exactly trust was going to take longer, and Caleb understood that and didn't begrudge it. But something that was the beginning of the possibility of trust. The crack in the wall where light starts coming through. Tommy went down the hall. Caleb heard the door close, heard the bolt slide home. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that.
This story was
He didn't
posted on the
sleep.
channel The Rusty
He sat
Saddle.
with his hands
Please do
around
not
his coffee
repost
cup
it in any
and
form.
listened to the house and thought about Daniel Voss, dead on a porch in the January cold, with $32 paid, and a contract that nobody had read honestly, and a child in a woodpile 10 feet away. He thought about Harlan Doss, who had not built the most powerful cattle operation in this county by being careless, who had lawyers in 2 cities and friends on the county board, and a foreman named Cole Raines who understood that certain problems were easier to solve while they were still small. A 9-year-old boy who could testify to murder was not a small problem. Caleb understood exactly what that meant. He'd been a lawman for 14 years before he quit. He understood the arithmetic of men like Doss, the calculation of risk, the willingness to act before the risk grew beyond managing. They would come looking for Tommy. Not maybe. They would come, and they would come before the boy could reach anyone with authority to listen. He stood up before dawn. He saddled Ranger in the dark, cold, and quiet. He rode 6 miles north to the town of Dusty Creek and was waiting on the step of the county sheriff's office when Frank Aldridge arrived with his key at 8 in the morning. Frank Aldridge was 54 years old and had been sheriff of Millstone County for 9 years, which was about 8.5 years longer than Caleb thought a man of his particular character should hold that office. He was not a bad man exactly. He was something more complicated, and in some ways worse, a man who had learned to be comfortable with what he chose not to see. He stopped when he found Caleb on his step. "Harding." His voice was careful. "Been a while." "It has." Caleb stood up. "Daniel Voss is dead. Shot on his porch last Tuesday by Cole Raines on Harlan Doss's order. I need you to ride out to the Broken Creek lease and collect the body and open a murder investigation." Aldridge's face went through several things quickly. None of them were surprise. "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. You got a witness?" "I do." Aldridge was quiet for a moment. He unlocked the door and pushed it open and didn't invite Caleb in, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. "Harlan Doss is a respected man in this county, Harding, a man who does a lot for this community, the school roof, the bridge on Fielder Road." "I didn't ask you about the school roof." Caleb's voice was flat. "I asked you to do your job." Aldridge turned around. His jaw had set into the particular stubborn line of a man who had made his decision before the conversation started and was now simply performing the discomfort of appearing to consider it. "You bring me something official. A sworn statement. Written testimony. I'll look at it. But I'm not riding out to Doss's range on the word of whoever you've been talking to, and I am not opening an investigation on Harlan Doss based on nothing but a rumor." "A child watched his father get shot in the face," Caleb said. "That's not a rumor." "Bring me the child," Aldridge said. "In writing, signed. So you can tell Doss he exists." Caleb held the man's gaze for one long, cold moment. Then he turned and walked back to Ranger. He rode back through Dusty Creek, at a walk which he hadn't planned to do, but the ride to Aldridge's office had taken him right past the main street, and something made him slow down. Something he wasn't ready to name, yet an instinct from a different version of himself, the version that had spent 14 years reading towns the way other men read weather. What he saw on Main Street was a town performing normalcy with slightly too much effort. Mrs. Clara Vane behind the counter of her general store, head down, not looking up when he passed. Reverend Mills on the steps of the church, watching him with an expression that was carefully, deliberately blank. 2 men outside the feed store, whose conversation stopped at the same moment Caleb walked Ranger past them, and didn't start again until he was 20 feet beyond. This town knew. That was what Caleb understood in that slow walk down Main Street. They knew Daniel Voss was dead. They knew who'd done it. And they'd arranged their faces around that knowledge and pinned them into expressions of ordinary life and decided every one of them that the distance between what they knew and what they would say was a distance they were willing to maintain. He'd seen it before. He'd seen it in every town he'd ever worked. The specific moral geometry of silence, the way people calculate that speaking costs more than staying quiet, and then make peace with that calculation by telling themselves it isn't cowardice. It's practicality. It's self-preservation. It's just the way things are. He'd made that calculation himself once. He knew exactly what it felt like from the inside. He rode back to his ranch and put Ranger in the barn and went into the kitchen and found Tommy sitting at the table with both hands flat on the wood looking at the wall. "You went to Aldridge," Tommy said. It wasn't a question. Caleb hung his coat. "I did." "He's Doss's man." "He's a man who's made choices for a long time," Caleb said. "I needed to know if that had changed." He pulled out the chair across from the boy and sat down. "It hasn't." Tommy's jaw worked. "So nobody's going to help?" "Aldridge isn't going to help." Caleb leaned on the table with both forearms. "That's not the same as nobody." He met the boy's eyes. "There's a federal marshal stationed in Billings named Roy Beckett. I worked with him 11 years ago. He is not Harlan Doss's man. He is not anybody's man, except the law's, which is a rarer thing than it ought to be." He paused. "I'm going to write him a letter today. I'm going to send it with the fastest rider I can find. And while we wait for his reply, you don't leave this ranch. You don't show your face on the road. You understand me?" Tommy was looking at him with that fractured, careful look again. "Why are you doing this?" "Because Cole Raines shot a man in front of his child and put his gun back in his holster and rode north like it was nothing," Caleb said. "And I am not going to sit on my ranch 3 miles away and call that none of my business. You don't even know us." "I know you now." Caleb's voice was even. "That's enough." The boy was quiet for a moment. Then, "They're going to come here. When they don't find me on the road, they'll start checking the farms. They'll come here." "Yes," Caleb said. "They will. And you're not scared of that." Caleb looked at him. He thought about Harlan Doss and Cole Raines and Frank Aldridge with his carefully blank expression. He thought about 14 years as a marshal and every town he'd walked into, knowing exactly how fast things could go wrong. He thought about what happens to a 9-year-old boy with no family and no protection when the man hunting him decides the risk isn't worth carrying. "I've been scared of plenty of things," Caleb said. "I've never been scared of doing what's right. Those are 2 different conversations." He stood up. "You hungry?" Tommy blinked. The shift in subject seemed to knock him sideways for a second. "Yeah." "Good." Caleb moved to the stove. "Then let's eat. And after we're going to talk about what you saw that Tuesday. Every detail. Because when Beckett comes, and he will come, I want you to be ready to say it clearly and exactly and without flinching." He looked back over his shoulder. "Can you do that?" The boy's jaw was set. His hands on the table were no longer loose and uncertain. They were flat and still with the specific stillness of someone who has decided something. "My papa tried to do the right thing," Tommy said quietly. "They killed him for it." He looked up. "I'm not going to let that be for nothing." Caleb held the boy's gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the stove. "No," he said. "We're not." The letter went out that afternoon with a writer named Pete Colson, 17 years old, and the fastest horseman in the South Valley, who owed Caleb a debt and didn't ask questions. Caleb folded the letter, pressed his thumb into the wax seal, and handed it over with 2 instructions. Billings Marshal Roy Beckett, his hands only. Pete was gone before the sun touched the ridge. Caleb came back inside and found Tommy on the porch looking north. Looking at the road that ran toward Dusty Creek and past it toward Doss's Range, 40,000 acres of Montana that a dead man had once stood between and a living child now stood for. "He's going to find out where I am," Tommy said without turning around. "Doss, it won't take him long." "Probably not," Caleb agreed. "And then he'll send Cole Raines. Or come himself." Caleb put his hand on the boy's shoulder, brief, firm the way a man does when he has no adequate words and knows it. "Let him come. This is my land, and you're under my roof. And whatever Cole Rains thinks is going to happen when he rides through my gate, I promise you it is not what is actually
This story
going to
was
happen."
posted on the channel The Rusty
Tommy
Saddle.
turned and looked
Please
up at
do
him.
not repost it
The
in any
boy's
form.
face in the late afternoon light was so young and so old at the same time, a child who had been forced into knowledge. No child should have to carry standing next to a man who had put down his purpose 7 years ago, and was only now in the cold January air of a Montana ranch beginning to understand that purpose had been waiting for him the whole time. "You were a lawman," Tommy said. "Before, I can tell." Caleb looked at the road. "Once." "What made you quit?" A long pause. The wind moved through the grass at the edge of the yard. Somewhere north on a road that was now empty, but wouldn't stay that way, Harlan Doss was making calculations. "I lost somebody," Caleb said, "and I decided the world could manage without me in it." He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about that." Tommy watched him with those grave, careful eyes. "Are you back now?" the boy asked. Caleb looked down at him. He thought about Pete Colson riding hard toward Billings with a sealed letter. He thought about Frank Aldridge's carefully blank expression. He thought about Cole Rains putting his gun back in his holster and riding north. He thought about a 9-year-old boy who had sat with his dying father in the January cold because there was no one else to stay. "Yeah," Caleb Harding said quietly. "I reckon I am." And somewhere on the road north, without either of them knowing it yet, a rider had already been sent south to find out where the Voss boy had gone. And the morning that was coming was going to ask both of them for more than they had given anything in a very long time. But right now, in the last light of a January afternoon on a small ranch 3 miles from a town that had chosen not to see a man and a boy stood on a porch together and watched the road, and for the first time in 9 days, Tommy Voss was not running. Cole Rains rode through the gate at noon the next day. Caleb heard the horses before he saw them. 2 riders unhurried the particular casual pace of men who don't feel the need to announce themselves because the announcement is built into who they are. He was splitting wood at the side of the house when they came up the track, and he set the axe down against the block and straightened up and waited. Tommy was inside. Caleb had told him that morning quietly and without drama that if he heard horses on the road, he was to go to the back room and stay there and not make a sound, regardless of what he heard through the walls. The boy had nodded once, the way he nodded when he understood something completely, and didn't need it explained twice. Cole Rains was a lean, weathered man in his early 40s with a face that had been handsome once and had since been rearranged by years of outdoor work and deliberate cruelty into something harder and less readable. He had pale gray eyes that moved constantly cataloging. He was the kind of man who counted things exits distances the position of other men's hands. He pulled up 10 feet from where Caleb stood and looked down at him with an expression of complete pleasantness. "Harding," he said. "Been a long time." "It has." Caleb kept his hands loose at his sides. "What can I do for you, Rains?" "Just a social call." Rains swung down from his horse with the ease of a man who'd spent more of his life in a saddle than out of it. The second rider stayed mounted, which Caleb noted without appearing to. "Mr. Doss asked me to check on the South Valley farms. Make sure everything's in order after that cold snap last week." "Everything's in order," Caleb said. "Good, good." Rains looked around the yard with that cataloging gaze. "You out here alone these days?" "Been alone 7 years?" Caleb said. "Nothing's changed." Rains turned the pleasantness up slightly, which made it worse rather than better. "You hear about that business with the Voss lease, Daniel Voss passing away?" Caleb looked at him. "I heard." "Terrible thing. Man leaves a boy behind, nobody to take him in." Rains shook his head with a practiced sadness that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Doss has been concerned about the child. Wants to make sure the boy is properly looked after. You wouldn't happen to have seen him come through this way." The air between the two men had the specific quality of a conversation that was about 2 completely different things at the same time. "Can't say that I have," Caleb said. Rains held his gaze for a moment. The pleasantness didn't move. That was the thing about Cole Rains, the pleasantness never moved, which was exactly what made it dangerous. A man who shows his anger is a man who's given you information. A man who keeps his face still has decided to keep his options open. If you do see him, Rains said, Mr. Doss would appreciate knowing. The boy's a minor with no guardian. There are legal responsibilities involved. He paused. Wouldn't want anything to happen to him out there alone in January. No, Caleb agreed. We wouldn't want that. Rains looked at him one moment longer. Then he touched the brim of his hat, swung back up into the saddle, and rode out the way he'd come, unhurried, the second rider falling in beside him. Caleb stood in the yard and watched them until they were off his land. Then he went inside. Tommy was in the back room, exactly where he was supposed to be, sitting on the floor with his back against the bed frame and his knees pulled to his chest. He heard Caleb's footsteps and looked up. Was it Rains? He asked. It was. What did he want? He wanted to know if you were here. Caleb pulled the chair from the corner and sat down. He also wanted me to know that he was asking. That's the part that matters. Tommy's brow furrowed. I don't understand. He wasn't really looking for you today. He knows you could be anywhere in this valley. He came to find out if I was going to be a problem. Caleb leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Now he knows I might be, which means Doss knows by tonight. Tommy absorbed that. So, they'll come back. With more men and a different kind of question. Caleb met the boy's eyes. Which means we need to move faster than I planned. I can't wait for Beckett to reply on his own schedule. What are we going to do? I'm going to ride into Dusty Creek this afternoon. There are people in that town who knew your father. Good people who've been quiet because they didn't have anyone to be loud alongside. He paused. I think it's time to find out how quiet they actually want to stay. Tommy looked at him with that old, careful, measuring look. You think people in that town are going to stand up to Harlan Doss? I think some of them have been waiting for a reason to, Caleb said. Fear isn't the same as indifference. I've learned that the hard way. He rode into Dusty Creek at 3 in the afternoon and went first to the general store. Clara Vane looked up when the door opened, and her expression did the thing it had done on Main Street the day before, that careful, deliberate settling into blankness. But Caleb had grown up in towns like this one, and he knew the difference between a blank face and an empty one, and Clara Vane's face was not empty. Mrs. Vane, he said. Mr. Harding. She kept her hands busy with the jar she'd been shelving. You knew Daniel Voss. Her hands stilled on the jar. Everybody knew Daniel Voss. How well? A pause. She set the jar down and turned around and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been calculating the cost of a thing for several days and has finally arrived at an answer. Well enough that when I heard what happened, I locked up early and went home and sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours without being able to eat my supper. Her voice was steady and factual and full of something held very tightly under both. Does that answer your question? It does, Caleb said. He left a boy. I know he did. The boy is safe right now. I'm trying to keep him that way. Caleb put both hands flat on the counter. I've written to Roy Beckett in Billings, federal marshal. But Rains came to my ranch this morning asking questions, which means Doss is going to move before Beckett can get here. I need people in this town to be willing to say out loud what they know about how Daniel Voss died. Clara Vane looked at him for a long time. The store was quiet around them, the particular late afternoon quiet of a small town going through its ordinary motions with an extraordinary thing sitting in its chest. You're asking me to go up against Harlan Doss, she said. I'm asking you to tell the truth about what you know, Caleb said. Those aren't the same thing, though they'll feel like it. They're the same thing in this county. But her voice wasn't refusing. It was identifying the cost, which was a different thing entirely. My husband has a grain contract with Doss's operation. If we lose that contract, I understand. Caleb didn't move. I'm not going to tell you the risk isn't real. It is.
This story was
I'm just
posted on the
asking
channel
whether
The
the risk
Rusty
of staying
Saddle.
quiet is
Please do
also
not
real.
repost it in any form.
He paused. Tommy Voss is 9 years old. He watched his father die, and he ran 3 days through January in bare feet. And he's sitting in my back room right now, trying to decide if there's a single adult in this world he can trust. He held her gaze. He deserves an answer. Clara Vane looked at the counter between them. She pressed her lips together and then released them. Raymond Tuttle, she said quietly. The county clerk. He's filed papers for Doss before. Documents he wasn't comfortable with. He told my husband about it 2 winters ago after too much whiskey at the church social. Her eyes came up. He's never said it to anyone official, but he said it to Walter, and Walter told me, and I have been sitting with it ever since. She stopped. If you go to Raymond and you tell him what you've told me, I think he might be ready to stop sitting with it. Caleb straightened up. Thank you, Mrs. Vane. Don't thank me yet. Her voice was dry. I haven't done anything but talk in my own store. But something had shifted in her face, the blankness gone, replaced with something sharper and more present. You bring that boy through this. You hear me? You bring him through. That's the plan, Caleb said. Raymond Tuttle was a small, precise man in his late 50s, who wore his discomfort the way other men wore hats permanently and tilted slightly to one side. He was at his desk in the clerk's office when Caleb walked in, and the way his hands went still on his paperwork when he saw who'd come through the door said everything Clara Vane had already told him. Harding. Tuttle's voice was cautious. I need to look at the Voss lease agreement, Caleb said. The original filing, and anything else Harlan Doss has filed with this county in the last 5 years. Tuttle's hands moved very slightly on the desk. Those are county records. They're public, Caleb said. By law. A silence. Tuttle looked at him with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something and trying to decide whether the drop was survivable. She sent you, Tuttle said finally. Not a question. She pointed me in the right direction, Caleb said. The rest is your decision. Tuttle was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed back from his desk and went to the back room. He came out with a stack of folders and set them on the long table without a word, and Caleb sat down and started to read. What he found in those folders confirmed everything Tommy had told him and added dimensions the boy couldn't have known. The original Voss lease agreement was their reasonable terms, standard language, a legitimate document. And beside it, filed 8 months later, was an amended version with Doss's attorney's name on it, and key clauses rewritten in language subtle enough that a quick review wouldn't catch the difference. The interest terms had tripled. The default provisions had been quietly altered to allow immediate land transfer rather than the 60-day cure period the original specified. There were 3 other files with the same pattern. 3 other families. Different names, same handwriting on the amendments, same attorney's signature, same subtle shifts in language that turned a fair agreement into a trap with a door that only opened one way. Caleb sat with those files for 40 minutes. When he looked up, Tuttle was standing in the doorway of the back room watching him. You've seen this before, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. Tuttle's jaw moved. I've filed what was brought to me. That's not what I asked. Another silence. Tuttle came slowly to the table and sat down in the chair against the wall. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years doing careful work with documents and numbers, and had understood at some level what some of those documents meant, and had made a series of choices to continue doing his careful work anyway. I have a wife, Tuttle said quietly. 2 daughters in school. Doss has 3 men on the county board. If I raise a flag on his filings, I lose this office inside a year, maybe faster. I know, Caleb said. I'm not asking you to do it alone. He leaned forward. I'm asking you to be ready. When Beckett gets here, and he will get here, he's going to need someone who can walk him through these documents and explain the discrepancies in language a judge will understand. That person needs to be you, not me, not a rancher from 3 miles south. You. He paused. Because you're the clerk. Your testimony about what was filed and what it means carries weight that nobody else's does. Tuttle looked at the stack of folders on the table. He looked at them for a long time, the way a man looks at something he's been avoiding meeting directly. Daniel Voss, he said. His voice had changed, quieter, stripped of the careful official register. He came in here 2 weeks before he died. Asked me to pull his lease file. He'd gotten a letter from a lawyer in Billings saying the amended version might not be enforceable. Tuttle stopped. I pulled it. He stood right there, and I watched him look at the two versions side by side. Another stop. He knew. As soon as he saw them together, he knew what had been done to him. He looked at me and he said, Mr. Tuttle, these aren't the same document. Tuttle's hands pressed flat on the table. And I said, Mr. Voss, I can only file what's brought to me. And he left. He looked up. That was the last time I saw him. The office was very quiet. I've thought about that conversation every day since I heard he was dead, Tuttle said. Every single day. Caleb looked at him steadily. Then help me make sure his son doesn't end up the same way. Tuttle held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not courage exactly, not yet, but the thing that comes just before courage. The decision that the weight of what you've been carrying is finally heavier than the weight of what acting will cost you. When Beckett arrives, Tuttle said slowly, I'll have every document ready, every filing. I'll walk him through each one. He paused. All of them. Caleb stood up. He put his hat back on. Thank you, Raymond. Tuttle looked at the folders. Don't thank me, he said quietly. I should have done this a long time ago. Caleb rode back south in the failing January light, with the cold coming hard off the mountains and the road empty in both directions, which was a thing that could mean nothing, or could mean that Rains had riders positioned off the main track, watching for exactly this. A man returning from town with the particular posture of someone who'd accomplished something. He kept his hand near his rifle and his eyes moving, and thought about Tommy in the back room of the ranch house, and Clara Vane behind her counter with her jaw set, and Raymond Tuttle sitting alone in the clerk's office with a stack of folders that told the story of what Harlan Doss had built in this county, and what it had cost the people who stood in his way. One by one, the quiet ones were finding their voice. Not loudly. Not yet. But the silence was cracking, and Caleb had been in enough counties in enough situations to understand what that meant, that there was a point at which the people who had been enduring stopped enduring, and when that point came, it came all at once. He reached the ranch without incident. He put Ranger up and went inside, and found Tommy at the kitchen table with a cup of water, and the expression of a boy who had spent the afternoon running through every possible bad outcome, and was now waiting to find out which one had arrived. Caleb hung his coat and sat down across from him. Rains will go back to Doss tonight, he said. By morning, Doss will know I've been asking questions in town, which means tomorrow is going to be a different kind of day. Tommy's hands tightened around the cup. How different? Caleb looked at the boy, at the set of his jaw and the steadiness in his eyes, and the 9-year-old courage that was holding itself together through sheer force of a grief too large for any child to carry gracefully. Different enough, Caleb said, that I need you to tell me right now every single thing you saw that Tuesday morning, every word Cole Rains said, every man who was there, every detail you remember. Tommy set the cup down. He straightened in the chair. And in the lamplight of that small Montana kitchen, he began to speak. Tommy talked for 2 hours. He talked the way a person talks when they've been holding something so long that the holding itself has become a kind of wound. Carefully at first, then faster, then with a flatness that was worse than either the specific emotional register of a child who has learned that if he doesn't put distance between himself and what he's describing, he won't be able to describe it at all. Caleb didn't interrupt. He sat across the table with his coffee going cold and listened, and when Tommy stopped to breathe or to press his hand over his eyes for a moment, Caleb waited without filling the silence because he understood that some silences need to be respected.
This
rather
story
than
was posted
fixed.
on the channel The
Cole
Rusty
Raines had
Saddle.
come with two
Please do
men.
not repost
Their
it in any
names, as
form.
best Tommy knew them, were Dutch, and a man everyone called Sutter. Dutch was a wide man with a red beard who'd ridden for Doss for 3 years. Sutter was younger, 20 maybe, and had the look of someone who was still in the process of deciding what kind of man he was going to be, which in Caleb's experience made him more dangerous than Dutch, not less. Raines had done the talking. He'd told Daniel Voss that the amended lease was valid, that the lawyer in Billings had no standing to contest a document already filed with the county, and that if Voss attempted to pursue the matter further, Doss would be compelled to call in the full debt immediately, rather than waiting for the standard transfer process. Daniel Voss had told him no. He'd said it quietly. Tommy said, not angry, not loud. He'd stood on his own porch with the letter from the Billings lawyer in his hand, and he'd said, I'm going to a Judge Cole, and I'm going to show him both versions of that paper and let him decide what they mean. That's all I'm going to do. That's the end of it. End of it. I know. Tommy's voice was hollow. That's the part that's hardest. That I did the right thing. Caleb understood exactly what the boy meant. That the survival instinct that had kept him alive and hidden was also the thing he'd been punishing himself for, the fact that the right thing and the good thing had not been the same thing, and he was 9 years old and had to live with that distinction. Your father wanted you alive, Caleb said. Whatever he would have wanted in that moment, that was the thing he wanted most. You being alive. He paused. Don't carry the guilt of surviving. That's not yours to carry. Tommy pressed his lips together and nodded once and looked at the table. Get some sleep, Caleb said. Tomorrow is going to ask a lot of both of us. He was right about that. Harlan Doss came himself at 10 in the morning. Not Raines this time, Doss, with 4 riders behind him, and the particular unhurried confidence of a man who has decided that the situation has progressed past the point where sending employees is sufficient. Caleb was on the porch when they rode up. He'd been expecting it since before dawn, and the expectation had settled him rather than unsettled him, the way preparation always felt different from dread. Harlan Doss was 60 years old and looked like prosperity. That was the only word for it. He was well-dressed, well-fed, and carried himself with the ease of a man who had spent decades being the largest presence in every room he walked into. He had a broad face that smiled easily, and eyes that didn't smile at all, ever under any circumstances. The eyes were the tell, if you were looking for one. He dismounted and walked toward the porch with his hands visible, and an expression of genuine-looking friendliness, and Caleb thought, not for the first time, that the most dangerous men he'd ever encountered in 14 years as a marshal had always been the ones who'd perfected the performance of reasonableness. Caleb Harding. Doss said, like the name itself was a pleasant surprise. I don't think we've spoken directly before. We haven't, Caleb said. That's a shame. Doss stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at him. I've always had a respect for what you did as a marshal. That kind of service to a community doesn't get enough recognition. He paused. I understand you had a conversation with Raymond Tuttle yesterday. I look at public records sometimes, Caleb said. It's legal. Doss smiled. Of course it is. Of course. He put one boot on the bottom step, not climbing, just occupying the space. I also understand that Cole rode out here yesterday and that you told him you hadn't seen the Voss boy. His tone didn't change. I'm hoping that's still accurate information. What exactly is it you want, Doss? I want what's best for that child. The sincerity in his voice was remarkable. A lesser man would have let the performance slip by now. Doss hadn't moved a muscle. He's a minor with no family and no guardian and no resources. What he needs is someone responsible to take him in, see that he's properly looked after and educated, and given a future. He spread his hands. I'm prepared to provide that. Out of the goodness of your heart, Caleb said. Out of a sense of community responsibility. Doss held his gaze. The boy may have gotten some confused ideas about what happened to his father. Grief does that to children. What he needs is stability, time, the right guidance to help him understand that what he thinks he saw and what actually happened are two different things. The air on the porch went very still. He doesn't have confused ideas, Caleb said. His voice came out quiet and completely flat. He has a clear memory and two eyes that were working fine that Tuesday morning. And there isn't enough time in the world or enough guidance from any source that is going to change what he saw into something different. He looked at Doss directly. We both know that. So let's not pretend otherwise. For just a moment, less than a second, something moved behind Harlan Doss's eyes that had nothing to do with friendliness or reasonableness or community responsibility. Something cold and very focused and entirely honest. Then it was gone, and the smile was back, but it was a different smile. Thinner. The performance of a man who has decided the audience doesn't matter anymore. You're making a significant mistake, Doss said. I've heard that before. Caleb put his hand on the porch post, usually from men who turned out to be wrong. I have lawyers in Billings and Helena. I have 3 members of the county board. I have Frank Aldridge. Doss's voice had shed its warmth entirely, not dramatically, just steadily, the way temperature drops before a storm. You have a worn-out ranch and a federal marshal you wrote a letter to who may or may not choose to make this county his priority. He paused. You cannot protect that boy. Not from me, not with what you have. I have what happened on that porch, Caleb said. And a child who will stand up in front of a judge and say exactly what he saw. That's what I have. And in my experience, that's more than you think it is. Doss looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his horse and mounted with that same unhurried ease. He looked down at Caleb from the saddle. Last chance, he said. Give me the boy. Walk away from this. I'll see to it that your grain contract for the spring season is renewed at a favorable rate, and that nobody in this county has any reason to make your life difficult. He said it the way a man offers a business arrangement, because that was what it was to him. Or don't, and find out what it costs. Ride off my land, Caleb said. Doss held his gaze one last moment. Then he turned his horse, and he and his 4 riders went back up the track, and Caleb stood on the porch and watched them go, and felt the specific quality of a door closing that would not open again. Tommy appeared in the doorway behind him. I heard, the boy said. I know. He's going to do something tonight. Tommy's voice was steady, 9 years old and steady. That's what he does. He came to give you a chance to step back, and you didn't, and now he's going to do something to show you what that costs. Yes, Caleb said. He is. So what do we do? Caleb came inside and went to the kitchen and wrote 2 notes. The first was to Clara Vane. The second was to Raymond Tuttle. He gave them both to Tommy with instructions to stay low in the saddle and ride the south trail, not the main road, and to leave them under the door of the store and the door of the clerk's office and come back fast. Tommy took the notes and looked at him. You're sending me into town alone. I need you moving, Caleb said. Doss's men are going to be watching this ranch. If they see me ride out, they'll follow. If they see a boy on a fast horse taking the south trail in the trees, they might not move fast enough to matter. He met Tommy's eyes. Can you do this? Yes. Ride fast. Don't stop for anyone on the road. If someone comes up alongside you, you cut into the trees and you don't come back to the road until they're gone. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. You come back to me. Whatever else happens, you come back. Tommy looked up at him with those grave, careful eyes. What are the notes for? I'm asking Clara to gather whoever in that town is willing to come to this ranch tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Caleb's voice was even. And I'm asking Raymond to bring the original Voss lease file and anything else he can carry that documents what Doss has filed in the last 5 years. You're bringing people here, Tommy said slowly. Witnesses. Dawes can burn my fence line, Caleb said. He can put men on my road. He can apply every kind of pressure a powerful man in a small county knows how to apply. But he cannot do it in front of 15 people who are willing to say they saw it. He paused. That's the only protection I know how to build in the time we have. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he took the notes and went to the barn. Caleb spent the afternoon doing 3 things. He cleaned his rifle with the particular focused attention of a man who needs his hands occupied while his mind works. He wrote a second letter to Roy Beckett, shorter than the first, with the specific details Tommy had given him the night before, names the date, the sequence of events on the Voss porch, and sealed it and set it by the door.
This story was posted on the channel
And he
The
sat at
Rusty
the
Saddle.
kitchen table
Please do
and
not
thought about
repost
the
it in any
arithmetic of
form.
what was coming. Doss had resources. He had men and money and legal infrastructure and a sheriff who looked away on request. What he did not have was speed. The county board moved slowly. Lawyers filed papers on schedules. The mechanisms of institutional power Caleb had learned in 14 years were powerful, but not fast. And the one thing that moved faster than any of them was the testimony of a witness who had already been heard by the right people. Tommy came back an hour before dark, flushed from riding and with the specific bright-eyed look of a child who has done something that scared him and is not yet sure whether to be proud of that. Mrs. Vane read the note right there in front of me, he said, dropping from the saddle. She didn't even finish it before she went to the back and started putting her coat on. He paused. She said to tell you she'd have 8 people here by 9 o'clock. Good, Caleb said. And Tuttle. Tommy's expression shifted. He was standing in his office holding the note when I left. He hadn't moved. He looked at Caleb. He looked scared. He is scared, Caleb said. That doesn't mean he won't come. They ate supper in near silence. The comfortable kind that had developed between them over 4 days. 2 people who had run out of small talk early and discovered they didn't need it. The fire was good. The wind was bad outside. And somewhere north of the South Trail, in a large house on 40,000 acres of Montana, Harlan Doss was making the calculation that men like him always made when the neat architecture of their power started to develop a crack. How much force is required, and how fast? The first rider came at 8:30. Silas Pruitt, leading his horse by the reins, hat in hand when Caleb opened the door. Caleb had known Pruitt vaguely, a South Valley rancher, mid-40s, with the weathered, honest face of a man who worked his own land and hadn't asked anything of anybody in a long time. I was at Doss's operation for 2 seasons, Pruitt said without preamble, standing in the doorway. Before I had enough to buy my own place. I saw things out there. He stopped. I never said anything because I had a family to feed and no way to fight what I was seeing. He looked at Caleb and then passed him at Tommy sitting at the kitchen table. I heard what happened to Daniel Voss. I knew Daniel. He was a good man who did everything right, and it didn't protect him. His jaw worked. I don't want to be a man who knew and stayed quiet a second time. Come in, Caleb said. By 9 o'clock, there were 11 people in his kitchen and front room. Clara Vane, her husband, Walter. Pruitt, 3 families from the south end of the valley whose names Caleb learned that night for the first time, a young man of about 20 who turned out to be the son of one of the other families Doss had taken land from 2 years earlier. And at 9:05, Raymond Tuttle, who arrived with a leather satchel under his arm and the expression of a man who had spent the last 6 hours deciding whether to walk through a door and had finally walked through it. Tuttle sat down at the table and opened the satchel and began laying out documents with the careful precision of a man who understood that the order in which things were presented mattered as much as what they said. Tommy watched all of it from his chair in the corner. He watched 11 people fill a kitchen that had been empty for 7 years, watched them sit with their hats in their hands, and their faces carrying the weight of things they'd been holding too long. Watched Raymond Tuttle's hands move steadily across the table, arranging the evidence of what had been done to his father and to others. And then something happened in the boy's face that Caleb had not seen there before. Not the fractured, careful measuring look. not the controlled flatness of someone managing grief by keeping it at arm's length. Something younger and more open than either the expression of a child registering for the first time and with the full force of surprise that he was not alone. Caleb saw it from across the room. He didn't say anything. He just filed it away, that expression, the way a man files away a thing he knows he will need to remember. It was Clara Vane who spoke first into the assembled quiet of that kitchen. She looked around at the faces, and then she said simply and clearly, "What do we need to do?" Caleb put his hands on the table. He looked at 11 people who had chosen on a cold January night to stop calculating the cost of speaking and speak anyway. He thought about Tommy's voice for 2 hours the night before, flat and careful, and telling the truth at enormous personal expense. He thought about Daniel Voss on a porch with a letter in his hand saying, "I'm going to a Judge Cole and the 9-year-old boy in the woodpile who had survived to say what happened next." "Here's what we're going to do," Caleb said. And outside somewhere on the North Road, a rider was moving fast through the dark toward Harlan Doss's ranch. And the night that was coming was going to be the kind that divided time into before and after, and everyone in that kitchen understood it, and not one of them left. Caleb laid it out the way he'd laid out every plan in 14 years as a marshal, not with false confidence, not with guarantees he couldn't make, but with the specific, honest clarity of a man who understood that people facing real risk deserved to know exactly what they were walking into. He told them about the second letter to Beckett. He told them what Raymond Tuttle had in his satchel and what it proved about the pattern of Doss's filings over 5 years. He told them that Silas Pruitt's testimony about what he'd witnessed on Doss's operation, combined with Tommy's account of what happened on the Voss porch, gave a federal marshal enough to open a criminal investigation that no county board and no local sheriff could shut down. Then he told them what he needed. "I need sworn statements," he said. "Written, signed, witnessed by at least 2 other people in this room. Whatever you know, whatever you saw, whatever was done to you or to someone you know that connects to Harlan Doss." He looked around the table. "Not rumors, not what somebody told somebody, what you know directly, what you are willing to stand up in front of a judge and say out loud." Walter Vane spoke first. He was a quiet man, Clara's husband, with the broad, careful hands of someone who'd spent his life working and the expression of a person who'd been waiting for a specific moment and had recognized it when it arrived. "Doss's men came to our store 2 years ago," he said. "Told us our grain contract would be canceled if we extended credit to the Harmon family after they defaulted on their lease payment. The Harmons lost their place inside of 3 months." He paused. "I extended the credit anyway, but I didn't say anything publicly. I told myself it wasn't enough to matter." He looked at his hands. "I'd like to say it now in writing if that counts for anything." "It counts," Caleb said. One by one they spoke. The young man, his name was Eddie Crane, and his father had lost 60 acres on the East Ridge to a Doss lease amendment 18 months ago, produced a folded letter from his coat pocket that his father had written the week before he died of a stroke, laying out every detail of what had been done to his family's land agreement. Eddie had been carrying it since the funeral, he said, not knowing who to bring it to. Tuttle took the letter and examined it and looked up with the expression of a man running legal calculations. "This is written testimony with a signature. It's admissible." He looked at Eddie. "Your father knew what he was doing when he wrote this. He said he didn't want it to just be a piece of paper in a box," Eddie said. His voice was controlled and very young. "He said somebody had to do something with it eventually." Tuttle set it carefully beside his other documents. His hands, Caleb noticed, had stopped shaking. They wrote for 2 hours. Tuttle organized it, drafted the formal language, walked each person through the specific wording that would carry legal weight as opposed to the wording that would simply carry feeling. Clara Vane and Pruitt witnessed every signature. Tommy sat in his corner and watched and didn't speak, and nobody pressed him to, because everyone in that room understood, without being told, that the boy had already given more than his share. It was past 11 when Caleb heard the horses. Not 1 or 2 this time. More. He held up his hand, and the room went immediately silent. 11 people who had enough collective experience with danger to recognize the signal without needing it explained. How many? Walter Vane asked quietly. Caleb was already at the window. 4, maybe 5.
This story was posted on the
Moving
channel
slow.
The Rusty Saddle.
He turned
Please do
around.
not repost it in any
Nobody
form.
goes outside. Nobody opens that door unless I say so. Whatever you hear, whatever happens out there, you stay in this room and you keep writing. He picked up his rifle from beside the door. You understand me? Clara Vane straightened in her chair. Go, she said, the way a woman says it when she means we'll handle what's in here, you handle what's out there. Caleb stepped onto the porch. There were 5 of them. Not Doss this time, not Rains. Men Caleb didn't recognize, which told him they'd been brought in from outside the county, the specific decision of a man who understood that using his own regular hands for this kind of work created witnesses he'd have to manage later. They sat their horses in a loose line at the edge of the yard, with the unhurried patience of people who'd been given a job and enough time to do it right. The one in front had a coil of rope across his saddle that he made no effort to conceal. The 2 on his left carried torches that weren't lit yet. Harding, the front man said. His voice was flat and businesslike. Mister, Doss wants the boy and the papers both. He's prepared to be reasonable about how this ends, but that offer has a short window. You rode 5 men out here in the dark with rope and torches, Caleb said. That's not what reasonable looks like. The rope and torches are a last resort. The man's tone didn't change. Hand over the boy and whatever Tuttle brought with him, and everyone in that house goes home tomorrow morning with nothing worse than a long night. The front door opened behind Caleb. He didn't turn around. He heard the footsteps, not one set, multiple, and then Raymond Tuttle was standing beside him on the porch with the leather satchel held against his chest, and Walter Vane was on his other side, and Silas Pruitt came to stand at the top of the porch steps with his arms crossed, and Clara Vane appeared in the doorway behind all of them. The man with the rope looked at the porch. He did the count. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes ran a quick calculation and came back with a different answer than he'd arrived with. This is county property now, Tuttle said. His voice was shaking slightly, but it was loud, and it was clear, and it was the voice of a man who had made a decision he was not going to unmake. Every document in this satchel has been registered and sealed, and a copy has been sent to a colleague in Helena. You take this satchel and you have paper. The record already exists. He paused. You cannot burn what has already been sent. The front man looked at him for a long moment. Where's the boy? The boy, Caleb said, is inside this house on my property, and he is not going anywhere with you or with anyone else Harlan Doss sends. He held the man's gaze. You want to talk about last resorts? Here's mine. You light those torches on my land, and you will have committed arson in front of 8 witnesses, who will all be giving sworn statements to a federal marshal inside of 48 hours. Whatever Doss is paying you, I promise, it is not enough to cover what that costs. He let that sit for a moment. Ride back. Tell him it's done. Tell him the papers are already out of his reach, and the witnesses are already talking, and Cole Raines already has a name on a federal document that connects him to a murder on the Voss porch. He paused. Tell him to get a lawyer. The front man was still for a long moment. He looked at the porch. He looked at the satchel in Tuttle's arms. He looked at Caleb's rifle and the particular stillness of a man who had carried one for 14 years and knew exactly when and how to use it. Then he turned his horse without a word, and the 5 riders went back up the north track, and the night closed behind them. Nobody on the porch moved for a moment. Then Walter Vane let out a breath that seemed to have been compressed in his chest for about 20 years. Pruitt sat down on the top porch step and put his face in his hands briefly, and then looked up at the stars. Tuttle was still holding the satchel. His hands had stopped shaking. Did you mean it? He asked quietly. About the copy in Helena. I sent it with Pete Colson on his second ride 2 days ago, Caleb said. Didn't know if I'd need it. Figured it was better to have it and not need it. He looked at the county clerk. You did good tonight, Raymond. Tuttle didn't answer right away. He looked at the satchel. Then he said very quietly, My wife is going to think I've lost my mind. Your wife, Clara Vane said from the doorway with absolute certainty, is going to think you've finally found it. They stayed until 2 in the morning. By the time the last person rode home through the January dark, there were 11 signed statements in Tuttle's satchel, along with Eddie Crane's father's letter and every original document from the clerk's files. The record was complete. The record was distributed. It existed in 3 locations in the satchel in Helena and in the memory of every person who'd sat in that kitchen. Harlan Doss could not undo what that night had built. When the last horse faded down the road, Caleb went back inside and found Tommy exactly where he'd been for the last 4 hours in his chair in the corner watching. The boy's eyes were very bright and very tired at the same time, the way eyes get when the person has taken in more than they can fully process, and their body is starting to demand that the processing wait until morning. Caleb sat down across from him. He didn't say anything right away. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that Clara Vane had made at some point during the evening and pushed one across to the boy and held the other. You heard all of it, Caleb said. Yes. How are you doing? Tommy thought about that with the seriousness he brought to every real question. Mr. Tuttle, he said finally, when he said my father's name out loud, in front of everybody. He stopped. He said it like it mattered, like it was a real name that meant something. He looked at his coffee cup. For a while after I started to wonder if my papa was just going to disappear. Like Doss could just make him disappear by killing him and taking the papers, and nobody would say his name again because they were scared. He paused. But all those people in there said his name tonight. They knew him. They remembered him. He was real, Caleb said. And what was done to him was real. And the people in this county knew it. They were just waiting for a reason to say it. Tommy nodded slowly. Like you said before, scared isn't the same as not caring. No, Caleb said. It isn't. The boy was quiet for a moment. Then, Cole Raines is still out there. He is. When Beckett comes, if Beckett comes. When, Caleb said. Tommy looked at him. When Beckett comes. Will it be enough? Everything Tuttle has, everything those people said tonight. Will a judge look at it and actually do something? It was the honest question. The one underneath the practical question, the one that was really asking whether the machinery of justice that had failed his father was going to work differently for a 9-year-old boy with no family and no resources and only the truth on his side. Caleb could have said yes. He could have made it simple and reassuring and let the boy sleep easier. He didn't, because Tommy had been lied to by comfortable reassurances before, and he deserved better than that. I think it's enough, Caleb said. I think what Tuttle has in that satchel is enough to put Cole Raines in front of a criminal court, and enough to strip Doss of every land contract he's filed in this county under fraudulent terms. I think your testimony is enough to make that case real. He paused. What I can't promise you is that it will be fast, or that it will be clean, or that it won't cost things along the way. Justice, in my experience, is rarely fast and never quite as clean as you need it to be. He held the boy's gaze. But I believe it gets there. I've seen it get there. Tommy absorbed that. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Caleb thought he might have drifted toward sleep in his chair. Then he said without looking up, My papa used to say that the difference between a good man and a bad one isn't whether they're scared. It's what they do while they're scared. Caleb said nothing. He sat with that for a moment. He sounds like a man worth remembering, he said finally. He was. Tommy's voice was steady. He was exactly that. Roy Beckett arrived on the 3rd day. He came without announcement, which was characteristic. Caleb had worked with Beckett long enough to know that the man considered advance notice a gift to people who might prefer he not arrive, and he had never been in the habit of giving gifts to that particular category of person. He rode in at 7 in the morning with a deputy named Goss, and the economical traveling posture of a man who'd covered distance fast and wasn't bothered by it. He was 51 years old, ears tie, lean and gray-templed with the unhurried eyes of someone who had been reading situations for 30 years and had long since stopped being surprised by what people were capable of. He shook Caleb's hand on the porch and looked at him with those steady eyes and said, "Your letter was thorough." "The situation required it," Caleb said. "Where's the boy?"
This story was posted on
Tommy
the channel
appeared in
The
the
Rusty
doorway.
Saddle. Please do not
He'd heard
repost
the
it in any
horses,
form.
and he'd come to the door on his own, which Caleb noted 4 days ago. The boy had pressed himself into a barn wall, trying to disappear. Now he was standing in a doorway, looking at a federal marshal with his chin level and his hands still. Beckett looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Your name is Tommy Voss." "Yes, sir." "I'm told you witnessed a murder." "Yes, sir." "Are you willing to tell me exactly what you saw?" Tommy didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. I've been waiting to." Beckett nodded once. He looked at Caleb. "Let's go inside." They sat at the kitchen table, Beckett, Goss, Caleb, and Tommy, and for the next hour, Tommy talked. He was better this time than he'd been the first night. Steadier, more precise because he'd already told it once, and the telling had made it something he could handle, rather than something that was handling him. He gave names, he gave sequence, he gave the exact words Cole Raines had said, before he fired and after. Beckett wrote everything down in a small notebook with a short pencil, and didn't interrupt once. When Tommy finished, Beckett closed the notebook and looked at Goss, and something passed between them that was the shorthand of two men who'd worked together long enough that full sentences were unnecessary. Then Beckett looked at Caleb. "The documents Tuttle has. He'll bring them to you this morning," Caleb said. "He's been expecting your arrival. The witnesses who gave statements 2 nights ago. Clara Vane can give you names and addresses for all 11. Beckett tapped the notebook against his palm. "Aldridge." "Not our man," Caleb said. "But he won't obstruct a federal investigation. He's smart enough to know which way this is going." Beckett nodded slowly. He looked at Tommy. "Son, I want you to understand something. What happens next is going to take time. Courts move slowly. There will be hearings and filings and more than one attempt by Doss's lawyers to complicate the process." He held the boy's gaze with the direct honesty of a man who didn't believe in softening what was true. "But I have your testimony, and I have 11 witnesses, and I have 5 years of documented fraud in a county clerk's files, and I have a dead man whose murder was witnessed by his own child." He paused. "Cole Raines will be in custody before this week is out. Harlan Doss will face federal charges. I want you to hear me say that directly, so you know it's not a maybe." Tommy looked at him. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Beckett said. And he said it the way a man says something he has measured carefully and found to be true. Something happened in Tommy's face then. Not relief exactly, because relief implies that the fear is gone, and the fear was not gone. It would take a long time for the fear to go, and Caleb understood that, and didn't expect otherwise. But underneath the fear, visible for just a moment, was something that had not been there when the boy first came into his barn 4 nights ago, covered in frost and wearing a coat that wasn't his. Something that looked cautiously and with great care, like the beginning of believing that things might actually be all right. Beckett and Goss rode into Dusty Creek an hour later, and Caleb stood on the porch and watched them go, and felt the specific quality of a weight shifting, not gone, not yet, but redistributed, shared across the right set of shoulders for the first time since this had started. Tommy came to stand beside him. He looked at the road where Beckett's horse had gone, and then he looked at Caleb. "What happens to me now?" he asked. "I mean, while the courts are working, while it's all going through." He stopped. His voice was careful the way it got when he was asking something important, and wasn't sure he was allowed to want the answer he wanted. "Where do I go?" Caleb looked at the boy. At the worn coat that was still too big for him, that he'd been wearing for 4 days straight, because it was the only thing he had that was warm enough. At the face that was 9 years old and ancient at the same time. At the hands that had stayed in the woodpile, and survived what they'd survived, and written nothing down, because there was no one to write to until 4 nights ago. "You stay here," Caleb said. It came out simply the way a thing comes out, when it has been true longer than you've known it. You're not going anywhere, Tommy. This is where you are. The boy looked at him. His jaw worked once. Then he looked away at the road and pressed his lips together and nodded. And Caleb looked away too, because some moments are too large to be looked at directly, and they both understood that. They stood on the porch together in the January cold, and the road ahead was not empty anymore. Cole Raines was taken into federal custody on a Thursday morning 4 days after Beckett rode into Dusty Creek. Caleb heard about it from Pete Colson, who came riding down the South Trail with the particular energy of a young man who has witnessed something significant and cannot wait to report it. Raines had been at Doss's ranch when Beckett and Goss arrived with the warrant, and by all accounts, he had not gone quietly, which surprised no one, but he had gone, which was the part that mattered. Caleb was splitting wood when Pete delivered the news, and he set the axe down and stood for a moment with his hands on the handle, and felt something move through his chest that wasn't quite satisfaction, and wasn't quite relief, but was somewhere in the territory between the two. The specific feeling of a thing that has been held in tension finally releasing. Tommy came out of the barn where he'd been helping with the horses, a task he'd taken on without being asked 3 days ago, because he was the kind of child who needed to be useful and had figured out on his own where he was needed. He looked at Pete and then at Caleb's face and read it immediately. Raines, he said. In custody, Caleb said. Federal. Tommy stood very still for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something was too large for an immediate response, and he needed to let it settle before he knew what he felt about it. He went back into the barn. Caleb let him go, because he understood that some news needs to be received privately before it can be received out loud. He found the boy 20 minutes later, sitting in the straw outside Ranger's stall, with his back against the wood and his arms around his knees. His face was dry. He'd been crying. Caleb could tell, but he'd finished before Caleb came in, which was also something he understood. Tommy was 9 years old, and had decided at some point in the last 2 weeks that grief was something he did in private, a decision Caleb respected, even as it ached to witness. He sat down on the floor beside him without a word. Ranger looked at them both with the large, patient indifference of a horse that has seen a great deal and found most of it unremarkable. After a while, Tommy said, "It doesn't feel like I thought it would." "How did you think it would feel?" "I don't know. Bigger. Like something would be different." He looked at his hands. "But my papa is still gone. And that's still the same." "Yes," Caleb said. "It is." "Does it get easier?" The still the same part. Caleb thought about that, honestly. He thought about 7 years of quiet farming, and the specific weight of a grief he'd decided to carry, by putting it down and walking away from everything that had surrounded it, and how that had not worked the way he'd expected, and how the weight had been there anyway, just carried differently, carried badly, carried in a way that had made him smaller rather than larger. "It changes shape," he said. "It doesn't get smaller exactly, but you get bigger around it. You build more around it until it's not the only thing there is." He paused. "That takes time, more time than feels fair." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then, "You lost someone too, before, when you quit being a marshal." It wasn't a question. Caleb had mentioned it once briefly, and the boy had filed it away with the careful attentiveness he applied to everything. "My wife," Caleb said. "Anna. She died of fever in the spring of '76. We'd been married 4 years." He looked at the barn wall. "I quit inside of a month. Told myself I was done. Told myself the world could manage its own problems." He stopped. "Told myself a lot of things that were easier than the truth." What was the truth? That I didn't know how to be in the world without her in it. And quitting was the only way I could think of to stop having to figure it out. He looked at the boy. "It didn't work. You can't actually quit the world. It keeps going whether you're participating or not." Tommy looked at him steadily. "Is that why you helped me, because you'd quit for long enough?" Caleb considered that. "Maybe partly. But mostly I helped you because you needed help, and I was there, and I still had the capacity to give it. He held the boy's gaze. That's the whole of it, Tommy. That's enough of a reason. The boy looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his head back against the stall and looked at the barn ceiling and said quietly, I'm glad you were there. So am I, Caleb said. More than I knew I was going to be. The
This
hearings
story was
began
posted
3
on the
weeks later
channel
in
The
county
Rusty
seat of
Saddle.
Millbridge,
Please
40
do not
miles north,
repost it in any
before a
form.
circuit judge named Arthur Peel, who had a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on the merciless and a particular impatience with men who used legal instruments to do what the law was designed to prevent. Raymond Tuttle drove up with his satchel and his carefully organized documentation and testified for 2 full days with the precise, exhaustive clarity of a man making up for 12 years of filed silence in one sustained act of public honesty. Clara Vane testified. Walter testified. Silas Pruitt testified, and named 3 specific incidents he'd witnessed on Doss's operation that corroborated the pattern Tuttle had documented in the contracts. Eddie Crane's father's letter was entered into evidence and read aloud in the courtroom, and Eddie sat in the gallery and listened to his dead father's words in a stranger's voice and kept his hands very still on his knees. Caleb testified. He gave 14 years of experience as context for what the documents meant and what the pattern of behavior indicated and what the specific legal exposure was. And he spoke with the calm authority of a man who had spent a long time not using what he knew and was now using all of it. Tommy testified last. He sat in the chair across the formal table in a courtroom full of adults, and he answered every question put to him directly and completely and with a clarity that left the room in the specific silence of people confronting something they cannot look away from. He described the porch. He described Cole Raines. He described the sound and what came after, and the woodpile and staying with his father until there was no reason to stay anymore. He said it all without embellishment and without flinching, and when he was done, there was a long moment in that courtroom where nobody spoke. Judge Peel looked at him and said, "Young man, you have given this court a very clear account." "Yes, sir," Tommy said. "I wanted it to be clear. I wanted there not to be any question about what happened." "There is no question," Peel said. And he said it with the weight of a man issuing a ruling rather than a reassurance. Cole Raines was convicted of murder in the 1st degree. He was sentenced to hang, and he did on a gray April morning at the Millbridge County Jail, and Caleb did not attend, and did not discuss it with Tommy, and Tommy did not ask, and that silence between them was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them needed to put into words. Harlan Doss was convicted on 11 counts of contract fraud and 2 counts of criminal conspiracy. The land taken under the fraudulent lease amendments was ordered returned to the surviving families or their heirs, which in Tommy's case meant the Broken Creek lease was restored in his name with a legal guardian appointed until he turned 21. Caleb filed the guardianship papers the same afternoon the verdict was delivered, and Tuttle witnessed them, and when Caleb came home and told Tommy what he'd done, the boy sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. "You didn't ask me," Tommy said finally. His voice wasn't accusatory. It was the observation of someone trying to understand the shape of what had just happened to him. "No," Caleb said. "I didn't." He sat down across from him. "I should have. I'm asking now." He held the boy's gaze. "Is it all right with you, Tommy?" Tommy looked at him. The kitchen was warm, and the fire was steady, and outside the April light was doing what April light does in Montana, arriving slowly and carefully, as though the land needs to be convinced that winter is genuinely over before it will believe the warmth is real. "You want to be my guardian," Tommy said. "I want you to have someone who is officially legally on paper responsible for you and fighting for you," Caleb said. "And I want that person to be me, because I'm the one who's going to do it regardless, and it might as well be done right." He paused. "But I'm asking you." The boy looked at the table. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had held onto a coat 3 sizes too big in a barn on a January night. The hands that had been still on a woodpile while the worst thing possible happened 10 feet away, the hands that had been flat on a courtroom table, while he told the truth about all of it in front of everyone who needed to hear it. "Yeah," Tommy said. His voice was rough. "It's all right with me." Frank Aldridge resigned his position as county sheriff in May before the county board could move to remove him, which they were going to do. He left Millstone County entirely, and nobody heard much about where he went. And the town of Dusty Creek elected a new sheriff in August, a woman named Ruth Corbin, who had run the South Valley postal route for 15 years and had the particular combination of backbone and fairness that the county had been missing in its law enforcement for a very long time. Doss's 40,000 acres were parceled and sold. Several families bought back land that had been taken from them at prices a circuit court arbitrator set at below market, specifically to account for the wrongful dispossession, which was not a remedy that appeared in any standard legal text, but which Judge Peel instituted anyway with the cheerful authority of a man who had decided the standard texts were insufficiently imaginative. Tuttle kept his position as county clerk. He was reappointed unanimously by the new county board in September, and at the small gathering Clara Vane organized to mark the occasion he stood in the back of the room with a cup of cider and looked slightly overwhelmed and very much like a man who had found the full version of himself and was still getting used to wearing it. The summer came on slowly, and then all at once, the way Montana summers do. By June, the south fields of the Harding Ranch were green and the fence lines were solid, and Tommy had grown an inch and a half since January, which Caleb had been tracking on the doorframe of the kitchen with a pencil mark every month, because it was the kind of thing a person in charge of a child was supposed to do, and he was still learning the shape of what that meant. One evening in late July, they were sitting on the porch after supper, the way they'd fallen into the habit of doing in the long light of the summer evenings. And Tommy said without looking over, "I've been thinking about my papa's lease." Caleb waited. "The land is mine now, legally, the Broken Creek 40. Tommy's voice was careful and deliberate the way it got when he'd been working something out for a long time and was finally ready to say it. "I want to work it. Not now, I know I'm not old enough now, but when I am." He paused. He spent 11 years building something on that land. He didn't get to keep it, but he built it. And I want to build it too, and call it what it is, which is his and mine both. Caleb looked at the field. The evening light was going gold across the grass, and somewhere down the south trail, a meadowlark was making its specific, persistent argument with the evening. "That's a good plan," he said. "You think he'd like that I'm going to work it?" "I think he'd like that you're here to have a plan at all," Caleb said. "Everything else is extra." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about you? When I'm old enough to work my own land, what happens to you?" Caleb looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean..." Tommy stopped, organized his words. "I've been thinking that you were alone for 7 years before I showed up, and I don't want to be somebody who leaves you alone again when I go to Broken Creek." He looked at Caleb with those grave, steady eyes. "I want you to come. I want you to be there." Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked at the field and the fence and the sky going from gold to amber at the horizon and thought about 7 years of choosing the smallest possible version of his own life, and what it had cost him, and what it had been worth, and what the alternative had looked like when it arrived in his barn on a January night in a coat 3 sizes too big. "All right," he said. Tommy nodded. He looked back at the field. "We could run cattle," he said. "The creek gives good water year-round. Papa always said it was the best land in the South Valley if a man worked it right." He was probably right about that. He was right about most things. Tommy's voice was even and clear, and full of the particular quality that grief acquires when it has been lived with long enough to become something a person can carry without it breaking them. Not gone, not forgotten, not made smaller, but integrated. Woven into the fabric of who they are in a way that honors what was lost, rather than hiding from it. "I used to think being his son was the saddest thing about me, because of what happened, because of what Doss did to him." He stopped, I don't think that anymore. What do you think now? Caleb asked. Tommy considered that with the full seriousness he brought to every real question. I think being his son is the best thing about me, he said. He was a good man who did everything right, and it still went wrong. And that's not his failure. That's the world being unfair, which the world does. But what he gave me before
This story
that,
was
who he
posted on the
was and what he
channel The
believed,
Rusty
and the
Saddle.
way he talked
Please
about
do not
doing right
repost
even
it
when
in
it
any
cost
form.
you. That's mine. Nobody took that. He looked at Caleb. Nobody could. Caleb sat with that for a long moment. He thought about Daniel Voss on a porch with a letter in his hand saying, "I'm going to a Judge Cole in the last seconds of his life." He thought about a 9-year-old boy in a woodpile staying still and surviving and carrying his father's name through everything that came after, through January cold and strange barns and courtrooms, and the long, slow machinery of justice grinding its way toward something that looked, in the end, like the truth. He thought about Anna, and about the 7 years he'd spent putting himself in a corner of the world and calling it peace. He thought about what it had taken to walk back out of that corner, and who had made him do it, and how the making had looked like a barefoot child in a coat 3 sizes too big, which was not the form he'd expected Grace to take, but which was he'd come to understand exactly the form it needed. Your father would be proud of you, Caleb said. Not because of how you testified, or because of what the court decided. Because of who you are right now, sitting on this porch making plans for land you're going to work in his name. He paused. That's the thing he'd want you to know. Tommy didn't say anything. He looked at the field and the fence line, and the summer evening settling across the South Valley, with its long gold light, and he didn't try to contain the expression on his face, which was something Caleb had watched him learn over 7 months, that some feelings are not problems to be managed, but truths to be acknowledged, and the acknowledging of them is not weakness, it is the thing that makes a person whole. After a while, the boy reached over and put his hand on Caleb's arm. Just briefly. The way a person does when words have run out, and the gesture has to carry what language can't. Caleb put his hand over the boy's and held it for a moment. Then they sat together in the fading light and watched the summer evening take the South Valley the way it always had, unhurried and enormous and indifferent to the smallness of men. And in that indifference, somehow a kind of comfort, because the world that continued through everything, through loss and silence, and the long hard work of justice, was also the world that held a porch and 2 cups of coffee and a boy who had survived, and a man who had come back from the corner he'd put himself in, and the land ahead of them, both green and waiting, which no one was ever going to take again. Tommy Voss had come into Caleb Harding's barn with nothing but the truth and a dead man's name, and he was leaving that January behind with something no court document could record, and no corrupt man could file away, and no amount of power could touch. He was leaving it with a home and a future, and someone standing beside him who intended to stay. And that, in the end, was everything his father had been trying to build all along.